Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Michael Cusack.
Hello, Richard. Great to be here.
Lovely to see you there in your studio. And your exhibition is Kissing the Apple at OLSEN Gallery in Sydney. And we'll come to that intriguing title very shortly. But on a much broader level to begin with, what would you describe as perhaps the main themes or elements that you've been exploring in your practice over the last few years, perhaps even the last decade or so?
I guess if I come back to almost the beginning, when I was at art school, which was 20 years ago, I started late. I was sort of doing minimal still lifes, and it was a touch of realism in there, but the forms kept breaking down and more, and they became very abstract, or pure abstract, as it were. And it was about discovering space, and it was a real push into pure abstraction. I didn't want them to be anything real. I was trying to discover a new way of making marks that didn't have a reference per se directly to something.
Where do you think this body of work sits in that exploration?
In this process, for this exhibition, there was a lot of drawing involved. Normally I have sketchbooks that I draw in. They become influences for the work. But in this case, I was actually drawing straight onto the canvas. So it was a much more direct process for me. So there's a lot of marks there that are not usually evident. So it was, I guess, a little bit more active.
That process, though, of multiple layers of palimpsests that we can see through semi-transparent paint has been part of your practice in various ways for a long time. But maybe, as you say, not so much with the drawn marks. Does that feel very different for you?
Yeah, it was refreshing. I think you're always looking to refresh every time. I'm not interested in doing what I did last time. I like to recreate a new field, as it were, or a new space. So always trying to upend how I was doing it previously to find a new way in. And it's the process that I really enjoy, is the mark making and getting in there.
Would it be fair to say that these works are perhaps more structural in their nature than some of the works of past years?
If we're specifically looking at this body of work, it sort of references a few architectural shapes or models, as it were, that I've held on to for a number of years that come in and out, where I'm using shadows or upending space, so it's not logical. I don't want it to. So I'm kind of putting the shadows in the front and the structures at the back, and kind of messing around with all that. Because I don't want it to be a place. I want it to be a sort of a new place.
Are there particular philosophies or principles of architecture, or even architects, that have specifically influenced you?
Not specifically, maybe, any great city you go to in Europe. I know I did a residency in Paris a number of years ago. That still has a residue, so the architecture there. I would say, to jump from all the actual physical architecture, it's more to do with language almost, and the breaking down of space. Now, you may or may not know that I'm a great fan of Samuel Beckett. And, I did a master's on Beckett and abstraction. And I'm interested in the philosophy of breaking down language in the same way breaking down painting.
What does that perhaps say about the way in which you have used paint over the years? Because there does seem to have been a language of your own that has developed in the type of paint that you've used and the way in which you've created those layers and transparency, which may have been used in various structures over the years, but a lot of that language has been constant.
that's the push-pull of using the material. I mean, I love paint, and I love testing out what it does. You know, that's like a writer would test out words. I'm sort of testing out how it comes together, or how it sits with, you know, how one color sits with another. It can be as formal as that.
So, in terms of those very distinctive looks of veils of colour, sometimes sitting over the top of others,
Yeah.
are those things that you deliberately work towards and then utilise, or are they essentially happy accidents?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're essentially happy accidents. Obviously, the tools are there, the paint is there to do that, but it's not formalized. I'm not, you know, planning it out. It is happenstance in the studio. It's what happens if you do this or you do that. And it's never a deliberate act. It's more that, you know, I never actually finish a painting. It's just when you come into the studio, you kind of know that it's finished or not. I can be working on a painting and trying to finish it and be hopeless at that. But, you know, one day you walk in and you know there's nothing else you can do to that painting to make it any better.
It's a dilemma that seems to be a challenge for so many artists, that sense of
Yeah.
feeling when something is completed. Can you give your personal, I guess we all have different versions of it, but your personal sense of what it is that falls into place that gives you that message of completion?
The process, I have to come back to the process again, because I layer up a lot. I put a lot of material on there. But to arrive at a painting, I have to almost take it all off. And it's not the addition of paint or not the addition of material that makes a painting, but actually it's a reductive process. So it's almost the less and less to get to some form of clarity where something new has arrived that I haven't seen before, that has, you know, I don't want to say shapes working against each other or beside each other, but something has happened there that I don't know about, that is intriguing and stays there and still moves. You know, a successful painting is elusive at the best of times.
You emphasised earlier the importance of exploration, of finding
Yeah.
and exploring new things. And the exhibition previous to this one certainly seemed very exploratory, because almost all of the works were very subtle and almost entirely, but quite clearly not entirely, white. So
Yeah.
what was happening there?
Well, when I started out 20 years ago, I started with white paintings, and I was doing that at art school. I was interested in working in what you would label the all whites. So it was paintings almost without color, so that you're exploring, you know, very subtle tones, and the structures had to stand up or survive without the addition of color. And so there was a lot to explore there in terms of the all whites. And it's always been on my radar. And, you know, I make a lot of work in the studio that doesn't come out of the studio. And it's important for me to make that work, to make paintings that leave the studio. But I wanted to get back to doing a show with the all whites again. And it seemed like a good time to do it. I had the opportunity to do the OLSEN Annex last year.
Let's go to the title now of this show, Kissing the Apple. Where did that come from?
It's a good question. Kissing the Apple, it's actually a throwback to a musical reference there. There's an English band called Pale Saints. They were around in England. They're from Leeds in the 80s. They had a song called Throwing Back the Apple. And it's sort of a misquotation of that in a way, because I didn't want to just quote that because it would always reference that. So I kind of changed it to Kissing the Apple because it was quite poetic. And also it was intriguing enough to know, well, what does that actually mean? And I'm very interested in how language plays out in terms of titles of shows and titles of paintings as well.
Going to the titles of works, many of them seem to have a European reference in this exhibition.
Yeah,
Prado, Fresco, Geneva,
yeah.
Le Bon, but then also rickshaw, which doesn't sound so European.
No, well, I just like the word rickshaw because I think it's such a strong word, and it comes out of the mouth like rickshaw. It flies out of there. So I like the sound of those words. So they're not actually, they're not they're not meant to represent the painting. There's some ways to throw you off. It's another abstraction. That language is an abstraction itself, like the paintings are.
And one of the largest works, if not the largest work in the exhibition, is simply entitled Sluice, which seems completely different again.
Yes, it's a kind of different type of word and a different sound and a different language than the Italian type ones, and it's just a word that's been in my journal for a while that I've picked up along the way, and it just has a nice connotation to it.
There does seem to be an austerity to that particular work, Sluice, compared with some of the other works in the exhibition, and yet it is the largest work in the exhibition.
Yeah.
How do you balance those two things?
That work was created off the canvas. It was created on the floor, as opposed to normally I work on stretched canvas. Sometimes I work on the floor unstretched. So that one was created that way. It still had structural shapes in it. It's just quite it's a balance between the two shapes with linear structure in between, and it's quite flat, and it's quite a little bit more ambiguous than the others, I would say.
What are your observations about the solidity of the structural forms around many of the works? There are quite large, quite solidly dark forms in most of the works, which almost seem to hold them together. What are your observations about that?
I don't like to be too specific about that, as I'm not as if I'm giving away big secrets or anything, but there is a big black shape, quite a large one, that's in a few of those works. And that's actually a shadow from Paris. It's actually from a picture I've taken, and it's between two buildings. And, in Paris, they've got lovely in-between bits in their architecture. So it's actually that shape which I have carried around, and it's almost like, well, let's throw that on the top.
We can still hear in your voice a little of the Irish lilt,
yes.
Indicative of your birthplace in Dublin, but you now are living and working near Mullumbimby, near Byron Bay in the north coast of New South Wales. How much of an influence is location in terms of how you work and what you produce?
Well, I think when I first came to Australia in 1982, I think it was, I lived in Sydney for 10 years, but I wasn't actually painting then. I was working in photographs and different things, and I didn't go to art school till I was in my 30s. But when I moved up to the north coast, the landscape is so beautiful up here, and driving through the landscape, and if you know the northern rivers and north coast, you know how it's dotted with all these, trees, and it was in my vision. I didn't want necessarily to be painting landscape paintings, but my first shows at the time when I was up here were all landscape, because I just couldn't get it out of my vision. It was there. So it was almost like I had to clear the decks, clear it out, to see things in a different way, to get back into working in abstract form again. But growing up in Ireland was very influential, and it wasn't about painting so much, but it was about writing, and we all wanted to be writers if we were living in Ireland, it seemed to be. But that was a very strong connection for me, and Ireland is still a very strong connection to the work. So it's kind of a homage to that.
Well, certainly what you have given us today is a very clear sense of connection to the works in this exhibition. So, Michael Cusack, thanks for sharing the exhibition with us.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much.